Greetings from the Asian Productivity Organization, Tokyo. This is Hương, and welcome to APO Productivity Talk. Today, our topic is about overcoming the middle income trap. And almost half of the world economy is classified under the middle income category. And in 2022, out of 217 economies, 108 countries are listed by the World Bank in the middle income rank. And in terms of population, is account for almost 3/4 of the world population, 5.8 billion people. And among the APO member economies, there are 16 countries under this income classification. So despite their aspiration to join the higher income rank, these countries are struggling to sustain their high growth rate that they used to have and to advance their social progress. They usually spend a long duration in the middle income stage. So this phenomenon of middle income trap has been amply discussed. There has been a lot of debate among scholars about defining the existence of the trap, its size and implication. And policymakers is also capture their attention and rings a bell to them to figure out what kind of reforms are necessary to avoid the so-called middle income trap situation. So today in APOP Talk, we are honored to invite Professor Dr. Kenichi Ohno from National Graduate Institute of Policy Study, Japan, to share with the audience about this not new but still very important topic. And thank you, Professor Ohno, for joining us today. And Professor Ohno held a PhD in economics from Stanford University. He used to serve as an economist in the IMF, and he has more than 30 years of research and teaching experience. Since 1996, he has been appointed professor at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies of Japan. His specialty is in development economics and industrial policy, with his main research interests in the industrialization process of the latecomers and his development experience of the East Asia. He also conducted policy study and provide policy advisory to the several government. And recently he's in dialogue with Ethiopian government. So Professor Ohno, could you enlighten us about this middle income trap phenomenon and the role of governments and policy with your presentation, please?
Okay, thank you very much for your introduction. And welcome to the story of the middle income trap and how we can overcome it. Well, I may not be able to give you a simple answer about overcoming the middle income trap, but I can perhaps give you some information and ideas to encourage you and maybe stimulate you to think about this very difficult problem. So let me just go to the slides. Okay, these are my contents today. Can I make it bigger? Okay. Well, let me start with the key message. I'd like to give you my key message, and this is the conclusion for today. And the message is, growth slowdown at middle income must be avoided by learning how to make effective policies to enhance private dynamism. And this requires a strong and persistent political will, a comparative and systematic perspective, and a creation of technocrats who draft and execute developmental policies. These conditions must be prepared by the top national leader, and random muddling through to cope with the problem at hand is not enough. The two key words here are policy quality and policy learning. Policy quality is the target. That's what we want to improve. And policy learning is the method of improving the policy. Let me look at some pictures. This is a picture of East Asian economies since 1950. This is how these economies are catching up with the per capita real income of the United States. And first, immediately you notice there's one problem here, the Japan, this dark blue line. That Japan is the only country which is stagnating among this group relative to the United States income. So that's a bad news for Japanese. For other countries, they are coming up, but coming up at very different speeds. And then the bottom countries are coming up at a very slow rate, so they are stuck at the lower middle income. This is the picture of Latin America. This is a traditional middle income trapped countries, and they're not doing very well recently. Similar situation for Russia and in Eastern Europe. And South Asia, this picture looks very different from East Asian picture. India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Bangladesh are coming up, as you can see, but they have a long way to go. And this is Africa, the similar stories. They are trapped in the middle income or even low income. Now, the question is, why do nations diverge like this? And this is my illustration to make some points. The first point is, if you are a country in a crisis, or just got independence or overcome internal war or something, you're still very poor. But if you join WTO, you work with IMF and World Bank, you join FTAs, for 10 or 20 years from the very low level, most countries, most economies grow relatively very fast. Then the World Bank and IMF will tell you, you have to liberalize, privatize, and integrate with the world. Then you reach maybe a lower middle income. Then there's a critical point in your history. Some countries accelerate here to go up to the high income. These are the countries that create internal value through human capital upgrading. And there are other countries that slow down from the middle income and go into the middle income trap. These are the countries that grow by given advantages only. And I'll talk about these given advantages in a few slides back. Let me say a few more words about this phase shift. Most developing countries start with the labor-intensive, low technology, export-oriented sectors, such as garment, footwear, food processing, and assembly of PCs and smartphones, very well. Domestic value creation is low at the beginning, and large amount of unskilled, usually female labor is needed. Few engineers and technicians are required per factory. These are the years when liberalization, privatization, and integration basically work. And the policy quality here is not very deep. You just negotiate with others, you make laws, you open up, you change the regulations. But there will be a time when you go to the next stage where establishment of high-tech, value-creating sectors, such as metal, machinery, chemicals, IT, well, it depends on the age and it depends on the country, but you have to go to a higher level. And that requires technology learning and retention of highly skilled engineers. Okay, and here the policy matters a lot. The effective policy is needed. If you can do this policy right, you go up. Otherwise, you are still stuck in the light manufacturing stage. So with this introduction, let me give you my definition of the middle income trap. A middle income trap is a situation where economy is stuck at income dictated by given resources and initial advantages and cannot rise beyond that level. Growth is given, not created. What I mean by given advantages are FDI, ODA, big projects, natural resources, or location advantages. These things will eventually end. The true source of development is value creation by domestic citizens and enterprises. And as I said before, countries may reach middle income by easy policies, liberalization, privatization, and globalization. But reaching higher income requires strong policy effort to stimulate private dynamism, not laissez-faire. Maybe this is controversial, but this is my belief after visiting so many countries. Okay, nations are not equal and policy quality matters. This green box is my basic formula. Economic performance, it depends on private dynamism, which is the main force, that's a driver of the economic development. Plus, policy quality matters, and external factors also matter. Sometimes you're lucky, sometimes you're unlucky. But in the very long run, external factors wash out, they fade out. These are not so important. And private dynamism will basically determine where the country will go after 10, 20, 50 years. Policy quality matters because policy enhances private dynamism. And that's the only thing the government can do about the private dynamism. So the lack of policy quality, according to my formula, is the main cause of the middle income or any other long-term growth problem like a high-income trap Japan is in, or even the low-income poverty trap. What kind of policies are needed? I think the middle-income traps are caused basically by two main reasons. One is the lack of growth momentum. The country just doesn't grow. That's a basic problem. Number two is the country grows, but there are new problems coming up and the country cannot cope with that. The biggest problem usually is the income gap. Other problems include the environmental problems and congestions and cultural change and so forth. I'll come back to this later. So you need to do these two policies, growth policy and social policy. You need both. One is not enough. And this is a diagram that shows a typical East Asia success pattern, at least in the late 20th century. And I think I have Taiwan and Korea in mind in the 70s and 80s. Well, you start with a growth policy, effective growth policy by developmental state, not a patrimonial state or populist state, but developmental state. That's the first difficult regime establishment. If you have this one, you can achieve the relatively high economic growth, but there will be an emergence of new problems. I already mentioned income, wealth gaps, environmental damage, and so forth down the line. Now, you have another set of policies, I call it social policy, to ameliorate these things. To me, growth policy and social policies are basically separable, different. You need both. If you succeed and social stability and popular support are maintained and you go circling a few times, after one generation or so, there will be emerging middle class. There will be popular demand for participation, political participation, and culture of solving disputes by votes and negotiation, not by terrorism. So the country exists to a more democratic, high-income society, and Korea and Taiwan did so in the 1980s. Let me talk a little bit more about growth policy. Now, my main research is to do the international comparison of government policies, industrial policies. And I visited many countries in Asia and Africa, and you can see this country list. I know Vietnam and Ethiopia very well because I have done what we call the policy dialogue with these governments. Vietnam for 27 years. And Ethiopia, 15 years. I know these countries very well. Well, we think that Asia grew much faster than Africa. But in terms of policy quality, I tell you that Asia is not always superior to Africa. Some African countries, such as Mauritius and Rwanda, and even Ethiopia, practice better industrial policy than Vietnam or Indonesia. Then you may say that why did Vietnam grow in the last 20, 30 years? My answer would be that these were driven by external factors, FDI, ODA, property bubbles, basically very diligent Vietnamese people, but not by policy. To a comparative eye, for people like me who visit the governments to check their qualities, the difference in policy quality is very obvious and very clear, but this fact must be conveyed by some quantitative indicators. So what I did next was to come up with the tentative measures of policy quality of the government. This is just my trial attempt. I have 10 policy areas which I think are important in industrial promotion. Number 1, industrial human resource. 2, domestic enterprise development, and so forth and so on. For each policy area, there are functional aspects that must be preserved or improved. Number 1, policy ownership. 2, vision and commitment of top leaders down the line. So I have 10 by 10 matrix, and I grade these cells by 0 to 5, score, just like professors grading students' term papers. And this is my result for Vietnam. I have done it several years back. And this is 10 by 10 scoring. And the overall grand average is 1.8 on the scale of 0 to 5, which is very low. And I give D to Vietnam, which is almost fading. This is the same thing for Ethiopia. The grand average is 3.0, which is not so good, but at least better than Vietnam. And I give Ethiopia B minus, or it could be C plus. And then for 13 countries, I did this kind of exercise. This is a summary. On the horizontal, I have industrial policy quality score of mine. And on the vertical, I have the logarithm of the per capita income. And with this only a very small sample of 13 economies, you see 3 groups. The first group is a proportionately growing countries from Singapore to Thailand. They improve income and policy quality at the same time. And then there's this Asian group, Indonesia, India, Vietnam, and Cambodia. They are already in the middle income, I think, but their quality, the policy quality is low. And then there's African countries, Rwanda and Ethiopia, that are still low-income countries, but their policy quality is not perfect at all, but at least better than the Asian group. Mauritius here is in the upper group. So some observations are as follows. Governments are not created equal. There is a huge gap in industrial policy quality from excellent to poor, from Singapore to Vietnam, or from Taiwan to, let's say, Cambodia. And I can detect this difference immediately when I read the policy documents or talk to the government officials a few times. Industrial policy quality and income level are positively correlated, and this suggests, but does not prove, causality. And within each country, policy quality is similar across different components. If one policy document or ministry is bad, others are also likely to be bad. There is a common policy culture prevailing in the entire government of any country. I have 3 slides that shows some of the ideas that I often discuss with the governments about the growth policy, the smiley curve, and the export value structure. This is a case of Vietnam. And then this is a 3-part strategy for FDI-led industrialization. This is a case of Ethiopia, improve domestic capacity, improve FDI policy for attracting a good FDI projects, and linkage promotion. I think these 3 ideas basically the same, not only for Ethiopia or Vietnam, but any country that are doing the same struggle toward the higher income should do this. Let me also talk a little bit more about social policy. And social policy is very wide and broad. So let me just concentrate on the income gap problem. There are two types of economies in East Asia. There are economies that had equal or equalizing income during their high growth periods. That was Japan, Korea, and Taiwan when they were growing very fast. The current situation is quite different, but when they were growing fast, they were equalizing. And then there are economies that had unequal or polarizing income during high growth. China, Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia, and I'm afraid Indonesia and Vietnam are joining this group. Why do they have these different, equalization results? There are both market forces and policy actions. Market forces basically mean that the rural urban migration usually have a tendency of equalizing income between the regions. And that's a very powerful one. In many countries, we see that. But also policy actions are very important, whether government will ameliorate this gap problem or not. Here is the Gini coefficient for selected countries. Now, Gini coefficient is a very difficult animal. The different researchers come up with different numbers, but the World Bank has combined and standardized Gini data for us, so that's what we have. For Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, I think when they were growing very fast, their income distribution was more equal or declining. That means becoming more equal. I would say that 0.4 or below are relatively equal area. If you look at Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, they grew fast relatively, but they remained relatively above 0.4. Their incomes did not converge domestically. And China started with very equal income domestically, and they ended up with a very unequal one. Okay. Let me just see how Japan did it. Japan, of course, they had internal migration, very powerful one, from rural to urban. Another important thing is the Japanese labor productivity and the wages rose very fast and at the same rate at 10% per year. So when wages are rising so fast, social stability and labor discipline were maintained. And at the same time, the industries did not lose competitiveness because productivity rose at the same rate. Okay. But there are also things that government did. Government offered subsidies, price control of the agricultural commodities, especially rice, agricultural protection, public investment, and so forth to rural areas. Urban taxes were used to build the railroads and so forth in their urban rural constituencies. That's what Japan did. For Korea, the Koreans did something called the Semaul Undong, or New Village Movement, from 1970. This was a top-down order from the President Park Chung-hee. Every village in Korea was given the physical input, actually bags of cement. And they were told to do something to improve the village infrastructure. And each village was rated and graded. And the good performing villages were receiving more cement and more support and training. And some people criticize this movement as a forced political propaganda of President Park. But if you look at the results, it's very impressive, and this is the data. Korean regional inequality was reducing dramatically to the extent that some rural regions became richer than Seoul, according to this study. In Taiwan, the land reform and SME dynamism were the key factors. land reform was successfully carried out in the very early years of the Kuomintang rule in Taiwan. And then Taiwanese SMEs were very dynamic and drove the growth in the early period. And not only that, SME administration under the Ministry of Economic Affairs conducted very active and effective SME support. So these are some of the examples how the social policies were conducted in Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. Now, let me just go up higher or deeper and ask the next level question. How can a government do a good growth policy and a good social policy? What do they need to do? What are the key ingredients? And my answer is good leadership and good technocrats. Let me start with a very general statement. National leader who is wise, strong, action-oriented, and respects democratic rules is crucial. I hope you will agree with me. And he or she is a primary force in changing goals, rules, behavior, and institution of that particular country. And professional and dedicated technocrats must support this leader. Both are needed for successful development in terms, the growth policy and social policies. One is not enough. You need a leader and you need a technocrats. But it is difficult to foster or install a competent leader. Nobody knows how to install a good leader in one particular country. But once such a leader is in power, he or she can create competent technocrats. And that's what exactly Taiwan did in the 1950s and what President Park did in Korea in 1960 when he seized power. Okay. Now, Ed Campos is a political economist, and he wrote some interesting chapters and books. One of them is World Bank's East Asian Miracle Report, 1993, Chapter 4, and The Key to the Asian Miracle, 1996. Ed Campos' idea in a nutshell is as follows. East Asia's high-performing economies attained shared growth because their governments deliberately created three necessary conditions. Number one, an inclusive mechanism to let all citizens participate in growth. For example, education and training, land reform, rural development, and strong SMEs. I just mentioned these things in connection with Japan, Taiwan, and Korea. Productive government and business relationship based on shared information, mutual respect, and joint decision-making. I will explain this in the following slides. And competent economic technocrats who pursue welfare for all rather than self-interest. And then Ed Campos says, countries that seriously make these institutional efforts can achieve shared growth. That is, institutions can be created, not given. And I think to think of this with three factors were all satisfied by Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, but not by others. So if you satisfy these conditions, probably you don't have to meet or trapped in the middle income. I just want to show you what the MITI, the Japanese Ministry of International Trade and Industry, did in terms of technocrats excellence. Japan grew very fast in 1960s. Now, Chalmers Johnson is an American political scientist who wrote this classical book called MITI and the Japanese Miracle. And this is what he says. The Japanese economic bureaucracy in the 1960s, 70s was different from both the Western model and communist planning. In Japan, the state role in the economy was shared with the private sector. Both the public and private sectors perfected means to make the market work for developmental goals. This pattern proved to be the most successful development strategy and was repeated in Taiwan, Korea, and Singapore, and so forth. Japanese analysts believe that the government was the inspiration and the cause of heavy chemical industry drive and structural transformation. MITI said industrial policy grew naturally and spontaneously without guiding theory. Only recently government tried to rationalize it. Now, I'd like to hear from Mr. Masatake Wada, who was the former MITI official during this high growth period. And he gave this lecture at our university last year, and this is the summary of his conclusion. Why MITI was effective. Number one, broad perspective and capacity. MITI's mandate was very wide. It covered industry, trade, energy, mining, SMEs, investment, technology, intellectual property. In some countries, different ministries handle these, but MITI had everything under its roof. Not only that, its functions were also broad. The entire policy-making chain was covered by MITI, from vision setting, research, consensus building, law drafting, implementation, and monitoring. It additionally had broad domestic and worldwide information networks. 2, clean and good relationship with politics. MITI submitted the policy proposals to politicians who deliberated on them. In turn, politicians also requested MITI to study certain issues and propose policies. So that's a give and take on both sides. MITI acted as a professional body independent of politics. 3, thick information network with private sectors. MITI and businesses share the same awareness and future visions. Industrial policy was a joint work between MITI and business circles, and this improved policy efficiency. Now, some people argue that the government should not pick winners. But when the government-business relationship comes up to this height, that MITI and businesses work together and they decide together, they are picking winners together. So the problem of government picking the wrong winners just melts away. Okay. 4, internal structure of MITI. I will explain by the next slide, but MITI has both vertical and horizontal bureaus. Moreover, MITI staff rotated every 2-3 years to experience many positions. They were becoming generalist or broad-minded officials. Number 5, which is also very important, strong motivation of MITI staff. Despite low salary, and Japanese central government officials have only low salary, MITI staff were very proud to work on industrialization, which was a big national dream in the 1960s. They were very concerned about Japan's future and organized private study meetings inviting academic and business people after working hours, no overtime pay. Okay. During the catch-up phase, the national goal was clear and opportunity was immense. Okay. And this is the MITI's structure. On one hand, we have the usual minister and the vice ministers. That's nothing new. But if you look at the main bureaus, the blue part is the horizontal bureau: trade policy, trade administration, industrial policy, locational issues, and environmental protection. And within each bureau, there are many subdivisions. The green box is the vertical bureau, basic industries bureau, and inside I think there's a steel and chemicals and plastic and so forth. And the machinery and information industries bureau, which include automobiles and computers and so forth and so on, and consumer goods industries bureau. So MITI had the horizontal and vertical bureau. They interacted, and there was a balance. Another thing is that there were attached organizations and external bureaus. Every ministry has these, but the feature of MITI was these offices and agencies were particularly competent and useful. about there's energy, there's a patent, there's SME agency was also very potent, so forth. Another important thing is this deliberation councils. This is the MITIs, actually the Japanese government, every ministry uses this. This is a consultative forum for external stakeholders. And then after deliberation councils approve, it goes to the law and the actual policy. So MITI actively used the deliberation councils for decision making. I think it still uses them. This is MITI's policy making procedure, which is always bottom up. The initial policy work starts with the MITI's junior staff in their 30s. They do lots of hearings with the stakeholders. They do the survey, they do the data analysis, and they prepare the initial draft. And it goes up to the MITI's internal subcommittee, which may approve or revise it. And then it goes to the deliberation council I just mentioned. This is a discussion with the external stakeholders, do the same thing, feedback and so forth. And then after that final report, that means that the law or the policy is finalized in the public relationship. I have other technocrat stories, but due to the limited time, I will not mention. But if I visit Singapore and Taiwan, I'm very impressed with the competence of the officials. Although they are quite different in terms of their nature. Singaporeans are very young, competent, and fast-speaking. Taiwanese officials are more relaxed, but they are all competent. Even Ethiopian officials, at least some of them are very serious learners. But country X and country Y, I was not very impressed. Let me just leave this at that. So my last point is we need good leaders and we need competent technocrats. But if you don't have them, what do you do? And my answer is policy learning. Leaders and the technocrats must do policy learning. The best way to improve policy capability is systematic comparison of international best and worst practices. That is the case studies of a very elaborate and advanced kind. Of course, the data analysis and mathematical modeling are indirectly useful, but they do not directly help policy learning. So when you study the other countries, use them as building blocks to create your own policy. Policy learning must be vigorous, systematic, and with proper local adjustment. Let me say 4 more things about policy learning. You must distinguish globally common factors and country-specific factors. These two are always present in any international comparison. Some people say that, Korea and Taiwan grew in the 1960s, the ages are different now. Of course, our ages are different from 1960s, but there are fundamental things that public-private relationship or education and training that are common. You must look at the common factors. You should not reject it because the ages and the periods are different. Build a general skill to create policies that fit your country. Don't copy and paste policies of others. Ask the right question and choose the right benchmark countries. And these are very difficult things to do. And these require deep knowledge and extensive experience. But if you don't have these deep knowledge and extensive experience, I suggest that you start with inviting competent foreign experts to guide you through the initial steps. And you can regain ownership when you accumulate sufficient policy skill. The biggest problem is that the competent foreign experts are few. Now, I'll just give you one idea called the translative adaptation when you do policy learning. This is a picture of developing country learning foreign things. Foreign systems, whatever it is, are imported from outside by various means. And there's a base society which is bigger than the foreign system, and there's an internal evolution inside the base society. Because these two systems are different, there will be conflicts and adjustments inevitably. The government must manage this. You must make sure the conflicts and adjustments lead to the good results, and make sure the internal systemic evolution will take place in the positive direction. If you do that, Professor Maegawa of Tsukuba University says that a latecomer is not really weak if it controls the type, terms, and speed of importation of foreign things, using them to stimulate the existing society for new growth. Even as foreign elements are added, the basic social structure remains intact. And the countries that can do it is doing the translative adaptation, importation with local adjustment. Now, with the last slides, I just show some examples of Meiji Japan, how 150 years ago, Japan learned the Western technology, but due to the limited time, I just go very fast. Meiji Japan used these 7 methods to learn technology overlapping way, but sequentially, and they were very successful. Kobu Daigakko, or Institute of Technology, was a university initially established by the British help, but internalized very quickly to create the technocrats, government elites for industrialization. And then Koto Kogyo Gakko, or high-level industry schools, are the institution that produces technicians and engineers who actually worked in the factory floors. And Japan successfully created these human resource fostering institutions. Later, in the 1950s, Japan started what we call Kaizen, or quality and productivity improvement. We learned from America and Europe, but we turned it around. So American style of top-down and statistical was modified to Japanese style: teamwork, bottom-up, and participatory. And when the model is created, there was a national diffusion and then the globalization. And then this diagram shows how Japan learned the American model and created the domestic model. Here's a US and European teachers, the models. What we had is a private sector organizations: Japan Productivity Center, Japan Union of Scientists and Engineers, and Japan Management Association. These NPOs did 3 steps. First, to learn foreign things, sending missions, inviting professors from abroad, translation of foreign materials, just learn how US is doing, Europe is doing. And then the next step is very important, to test and modify so that the American model is no longer American, it becomes a Japanese model with proper adjustment. And then to diffuse by various means. I think that any country has to do these 3 steps when you're learning policies or technology from other countries. This is not just particular to Japan or the post-war period. And my last slide, this is the list of Japan's, actually JICA's policy dialogue with the developing countries in the more recent period. This is a selected list. The point is that Japan believes that other countries should also do the policy learning, and we're trying to help other countries to learn. Okay, so let me conclude here by saying, let me summarize my discussion. First, growth policy and social policies are needed to overcome the middle income trap. Number 2, to execute these policies, we need good national leaders and competent technocrats. And number 3, if leaders and technocrats are not yet good, you must improve them by systematic policy learning. In other words, countries that cannot do this policy learning will be probably trapped in the middle income. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Ohno, for your very informative sharing about the middle income traps, as well as the emphasis on the core elements of effective policy making in dealing with this phenomenon. And to our viewers, please feel free to raise your question to discuss with our speaker, Professor Ohno, by leaving your comments in the chat box. While waiting for other questions to come, there's a first question that we would like to raise to you. You mentioned about the definition of the trap, but under this category, there are lower middle income countries and upper middle income countries. So the question is, do symptoms of the middle income trap differ for lower middle income and upper middle income countries?
Well, I guess upper and lower middle income follow the World Bank definitions usually. I can say that the problems are different at the lower middle income. This is the idea of Professor Cham Van To of Vietnam. At the lower level, you're still learning, you're catching up, you're doing still what I call the first phase problems. Open up, do FTA, and you're still in the catching up with the higher range. But if you go to the upper middle income, it's becoming close to $10,000 range. I think you need to innovate. You need the technology and the engineering, and with your domestic human resources and institutions. So I think upper middle income countries, you must really start creating the value domestically. You can adjust to improve receive lots of FDI, and hope the FDI will give you Industry 4.0 or something. Sometimes I feel that Thailand's policy, Thailand is already upper middle income, and you should go this way. You should not really rely on FDI anymore, but I think Thailand wants to invite Japanese and other investors to come there, 4.0. Let me stop this. I think you have to graduate from the catching up phase and you have to go to the innovation phase.
Yeah, thank you for your answer, which is emphasizing on the different sources of innovation and resources at different stage, like foreign sources for the lower middle income and domestic or indigenous sources of effort for their upper one to catch up and to graduate. We have another question from the viewer called Ziol Haq. What is the motivational factor that low salary staff work even after office hour? Is there any incentive, monthly or yearly? I think he referred to the case of MITI slide that you were elaborating.
I think that's a very difficult question. How do people work, so enthusiastically with low salary? I don't know the answer. I don't have the answer. I give a lecture to my foreign students, and they also wonder, even today, Japanese government officials are receiving so little salary. Even the technicians and engineers receive the same salary as the other officials without such a qualification. Why do they do that? I don't know. That's my answer. And I think other countries, almost all the countries I visited, they require higher salaries in order to work harder. And otherwise, they have to have a second job, a third job. They just quit at 3 p.m. and go to the third job, second job. If you're in that situation, how can we expect the technocrats to work so hard for the country? I don't have the answer. I don't have the answer, but that's, I think, the Japanese tradition. I also hear that the Meiji period, 150 years ago, first Japanese MOF officials were queuing up in front of the building of the office at 5 a.m., work very hard from the early morning. I don't know where it comes from. But I would not recommend this as the main policy measure, because people don't change very much. I think you have to give them incentives to work hard, especially the technocrats. the advisors to the PM and the presidents and the economic planning units officials, I think they have to be well paid with lots of privileges. I think my advice to the normal countries, not Japan, is that you must reduce the number of the officials. Many of the things must be outsourced, driving and cleaning and so forth, and the simple work. And then reduce the size of the bureaucracy and then pay well for the remaining people. But they must remain with the competition. They must be tested and they have to be interviewed in order to be promoted. I think Malaysian bureaucracy have to be interviewed and pass in order to get promoted. I think that kind of thing is necessary. I don't expect many people to work just very hard with low salary. So I think salary increase is necessary.
Thank you for your answer. And even though you say that you don't know for the direct answer to his question, but you provide a lot of advices to the other country to provide more incentive to their government official. We have one follow-up question from the same viewers. Could you please just quickly help him? Can foreign debt be a factor for the middle income trap? Could you?
Can foreign debt be a factor to the middle income? Well, that's more macroeconomic. I think the debt problem and the international balance of payments problems are more the symptoms rather than the cause of the middle income trap. Middle income trap means that the growth momentum is not enough, and you borrow too much, but you cannot pay back. I think I would not call that a cause of the middle income trap. I think that's a symptom of the result. The cause of the middle income, of the lack of the growth momentum, as I said, that's a primary, or the society becomes disintegrated because the division of income is so serious, or the ethnicities start to fight, or the different classes start to become antagonistic. They cannot cooperate. So my answer is no. I think foreign debt will be the results. Reducing the foreign debt will not solve the problem of this growth momentum. If the country is not growing, you will get I think there will be the G20 is talking about the debt forgiveness now. Even if your debt is forgiven, I think that you will get into the same trap again.
Yeah, so in short, it's more the consequence and the symptom rather than a cause of this phenomenon. Right. We have one question from Professor Kumar Ray from India. In the current world situation, what are critical problems in industry, in your view?
The critical problems in industries, I think we're talking about. One is there are a few things that the new industrialists or the companies have to think about. One is this technology improvement, or 4.0 or AI, that the world is changing, technology is changing. So maybe the manufacturing of the traditional type may work or may not work in the new IT era. That's one. So everyone has to adjust to the new era. You have to make a technology jump. Some of the things may stay. Some of the things you have to work with the private sector. You have to have the good leader. I don't think these things will change, but some of the details will change. Number two, I think we are in the era of SDGs. So environment, sustainability, and the corporate responsibility, these things must be ingrained in formulating the policies much more than the past. So and then also the globalization situation is changing. We thought that the globalization is going very deep, but now more recently, well, with the coronavirus and also the Ukraine situation, maybe the too much globalization is a little bit risky. So when you make policies and when enterprises make strategies, you have to think about this dynamic of globalization. I can think of these three right now off the hand.
Thank you for your answer, Professor. In your presentation, you have highlighting the role of building up the domestic capacity, and some of the slide, I think, is the mentioning that FDI is not enough for this country. So the question here is the role of knowledge spillovers through FDI insufficient for industrial upgrading of the middle income country?
Well, we created the FDI report for Ethiopia, but I think the conclusion will be the same for all countries. FDI, receiving lots of FDI is probably a good thing but FDI will not transfer, technology or improve your skills automatically. That you must prepare the domestic conditions for FDI to willingly do these things. And that's where the policy matters. And I show in one of the diagrams, I show the three-part strategy for FDI to comfortably and willingly transfer technology, expand the scope of the business in that country. That will require lots of domestic policy effort. Not only policy effort, but domestic workers and domestic engineers and domestic managers must improve. So the FDI will be very happy to stay in that country and create value. So in that sense, as I said, FDI alone, just letting FDI come, and when your wage becomes higher, they leave for other countries, that is not what you need to do with the FDI. FDI is something, the starter, and then you can use it very effectively for your value creation. But if you don't do these domestic policies, FDI will come, they will do a very low value creation, and they leave when your wages are too high. So it's not a question of FDI is good or bad. It's whether the domestic labor manager and the policymakers can take an advantage of that. And that's the big difference. Some countries, such as Japan and Korea, and then Taiwan, we didn't need so much FDI. We could do that ourselves. But initially, we just borrow technology. If the domestic capability is so high from the beginning, you can do this. But most countries, it's better to let the FDI come and work with them and create value. So that also requires a lot of domestic policy making.
Right. So enhancing the domestic or absorptive capacity of a country is more or less the answer to this, rather than just focusing on FDI, we guess.
Yes, please.
We have another question that relating to your presentation about how do you compare the approach of East Asia developmental state with the private sector-led economic development success, as in the case of Switzerland?
Switzerland. Mm-hmm. Okay. I think East Asia in the 1970s, 80s, it was usual to have what we call the authoritarian developmentalism. Taiwan and Korea especially, but some other countries followed the similar pattern, Singapore, Malaysia to some extent. I think that's one possible choice. Let me say this way, that you cannot do the autocratic developmental state today. You must be more democratic. You must have an election, fair election. You must maintain the human rights and so forth. But I think the relatively strong developmental state is still consistent with some democratic rules without violation of the human rights and so forth. It's a subtle argument, and which I don't have much time. But I think what we need to learn from developmental state in the past is some of the elements are worth discussing, like export steering committee of Korea that Korea used 1960s and 70s. I think you can learn from that. That has nothing to do with human rights violation and the separation of media. So I think you should become functional in learning from the Asia's developmental state. You should not import wholesale, but you have to check some of the things that can be applied today. I already told you about some of the things are unique to the country and unique to the age, but some of the things are universal. So learn universal things from the developmental state. Private sector-led economic development is possible in some countries where the private sector dynamism is already relatively strong. I think Indians and Chinese people are relatively good, merchants and producers. So even without the government's help, they will do it. But they will do better if the private sector, the government supports them effectively. But not every country do the private sector-led economic development if your private sector is still very weak.
Right. We have another question from Nepal. We have quite a numbers of questions awaiting here for your answer. The next one is from Nepal, Undersecretary of Nepal. Is there any way to improve the capability of leaders and technocrats? And is there any good practical example for this? Can you give a short answer to the
I
viewer?
think if you have a not inactive leader, not so willing leader, nobody can change his or her mind. I don't think you can operationalize what leader does. So if you don't have a very active leader, you're stuck. But I don't think we can change the leaders just because he or she is not developmental. As I said, there's nothing you can do. So that's a very difficult question. Leadership is so important, but if you elect a not so active leader or not so developmental leader, I can't do anything about it. I don't have any advice. Wait for another one. I have no answer to this. When I do policy dialogue, when JICA does policy dialogue, we select from many countries. We select the best ones. Which means that the president or prime minister is very willing to talk to Japan or JICA or Japanese experts to learn something from it. This mindset or seriousness is the factor that propel us to do the policy dialogue. If you don't have that condition, if the top leader is not interested in development but something else, I think there's no hope. And I don't have any method how to remove this kind of leader. So that's a fact. I don't want to be too optimistic about every country. Okay.
Thank you for your answer. And here we have another one. Should a middle-income country look at a way to stimulate and expand its internal consumption? Always look at targeting external markets.
Well, that's a more technical problem. What you should do, not how to do it. I'm sort of neutral about whether your country or another country should target the domestic consumers rather than export markets. It depends. Basically, you should target both, but which one is more important depends on in each country's situation. I will not give any general answer. The countries like, of course, China or India, Africa domestic market is so huge, so you can start there. Japan also was really relatively large in terms of population, so Japan enjoyed the large domestic market. But I think the Korea's market was not big enough, so I think Korea started with the export market. It depends on the country. And I don't have any answer to that. One is just the economic size is one thing. Another thing is probably what kind of private sector companies you have, and if they are more domestically oriented, start with the domestic market. If they are exporting, help them export. I don't think you should say that this domestic market or export market is better. It depends on each country.
Right. Thank you, Professor. And we are running out of time, so there's a last question for you. Is the existence of significant informal economy always a major hindrance to the middle-income trap avoidance?
I don't think informal economy is the problem. I think in most countries have the informal sector, which becomes more formalized as the economy grows, and then the formal sector absorbs such informal labor because there's a labor shortage. Labor shortage occurs according to the dual model. Because the economy grows and the industries and services need more modern and skilled labor. That's why the informal sector becomes more formal. So again, I would say that the larger existence of the informal sector is the result of the country not having a very vibrant formal sector growing, and that also comes from that lack of the growth sector. So I would not blame the informal sector for creating the middle income trap. I think that they are the result of the weak growth policy. And that was the last question, I think.
Yes, we have quite overwhelming number of questions, actually. Maybe your presentation is very interesting and is inviting a lot of questions. But thank you very much for your sharing today. And you have elaborated in a very concise and easy to understand way about the middle income traps is policy lessons. And you also highlighted about the imperative of dual focus on both growth policies and social policy, the complementary role of leaderships and technocrats, and also the needs to localize the policy learning of the other countries, as well as the example of the East Asian growth models. So we expect that is useful for our viewers today. And thank you, our viewers, for your interactive communicating with the professor. And with your overwhelming number of questions, for some, we might not be able to have time to address all, but we hope that the discussion and the sharings among the professor to all our viewers are helpful to you, and you enjoy that insightful sharing. So we look forward to seeing you again in the future productivity talks of the APO. So meanwhile, please stay safe and stay tuned with the APO productivity talks. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.